Cheryl Strayed stood at the edge of the Pacific Crest Trail as that's right. She's planning to go on the Pacific Crest. She's going to go on her own journey now. So Cheryl Strayed stood at the edge of the Pacific Crest Trail as it overlooked a sea of deep green trees hundreds of feet below. From the height, she could see their tops swaying in a subtle breeze as it went past. She sat down to remove her boots. Strayed was on a journey, and at this point she had hiked hundreds of miles of that trail. She went for days without seeing a soul, with no one for company but her giant backpack that she had nicknamed Monster. But she needed a break, and so she sat down to remove her boots. They were too small, she had discovered belatedly. She began to count the passing of miles with how bruised and beaten her feet looked, and even how many toenails she had lost. As she began to delicately knead the sore flesh of her foot, her giant backpack toppled over. It hit her right boot in just the right way, which then skittered over the trail and flew over the edge of the mountain. She got to the edge just in time to watch it disappear into the forest canopy below. For a moment, she thought, this has to be a cosmic joke. That someone would pop out of the woods from behind her and give her her boot back, or that time would reverse itself and she would see the boot retrace its path from hundreds of feet below back up to the trail. But of course, it wouldn't. And so, clutching the orphan boot to her chest for a brief moment, she hitched it over the side with all of her might. It was one more thing that the trail would take from her. But what the trail takes, in comparison to what it gives, is a tiny fraction. The metaphor of a path, one that winds deeply into the past and then far forward into the future, is an appropriate metaphor today. We welcome a new church year and celebrate with our Jewish friends Rosh Hashanah, their new year. There is the dedication of Margot and the reflection that act invites on the human journey as it is just beginning. We've rededicated our sanctuary, looking back to 50 years in this place. We also celebrate the communion of waters, the symbol of our lives that branch from many diverse places and join together in the spiritual journey that is this community. The trail leads back, and it also leads on. And we reflect today on the journey of our lives and the journey of this community. Wild, from Lost to Found on the Pacific Crest Trail, is the name of Strayed's memoir. It has now been made into a movie starring Reese Witherspoon. And I had purchased the book on the advice of a friend, and I'm so glad that I did. It contains an incredible message of mistakes made and lessons learned on the journey of life. I like to think of it as something of a companion to our own journeys that we celebrate here today, all of the wild, beautiful things that led us to being together in this moment. Now, Strayed's journey begins in a hospital room. She is 23 and her mother is 45. Less than half a year before, her mother had been diagnosed with a virulent form of cancer. It spread more quickly than the doctors could imagine. Strayed is absolutely stunned by it, writing, "My mother died fast, but not all of a sudden. A slow burning when flames disappear to smoke and then smoke to air. She didn't have time to get skinny. She was altered but still fleshy when she died, the body of a woman among the living. Even though Strayed was married to a man named Paul at that time, it was her mother who was her anchor. When her mom dies, she becomes unmoored. She desperately reaches out to her siblings, her stepfather, to her husband, but the more she tries to grasp for them, the more they slip away from her. She begins to medicate herself with hard drugs and casual sex. Her marriage comes apart. Despite her best efforts, her brother and sister want nothing to do with her. She feels utterly alone and lonely in the world. The Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh asks a provocative question in his book, No Mud, No Lotus. He asks the question of whether the Buddha ever suffered. When Han first became a monk, he says he did so because he thought the Buddha was a model of someone who was immune to suffering. By being enlightened, he didn't feel hunger or heartache or regret or pain. But the deeper Han went into his practice, he began to realize that this couldn't be so. Instead, he realized that the Buddha had to travel deeply into human suffering, his own and the suffering of others, in order to craft the powerful response that he did. Now, Cheryl Strayed is not Buddha, and I think she'd be modest enough to laugh at that analogy. However, she is someone who takes the pain and suffering in her journey and works to transform it. Her long hike is not about leaving behind her past life, but rather, as the title of the book suggests, finding meaning through those hardships and moving forward from there. Now, the idea for the trip of taking this long hike on the Pacific Crest Trail comes to her as a fluke. She had just filed for divorce with her husband, and then tagging along with a friend, hoping to be somewhat distracted, she finds herself at the checkout to an REI store. She looks over at the metal rack with all of the shiny book covers, and she sees a book called Pacific Crest Trail, Volume 1. She buys it, and the idea is planted in her mind. She will hike the trail that summer. Why? She doesn't exactly know. She just knows that she has to do something, and she thinks this might be it. It wells up inside of her, and she makes the decision to leap. Inside of 6 months, she's standing in the Mojave Desert at the beginning of the trail. At that moment, standing at the trail's mouth, she can hardly anticipate all of the dangers and hardships that lie ahead of her. The trail itself winds its way all the way from Mexico to Canada. It's a difficult journey even for the most experienced hiker. It goes to the snowy tops of the Sierras and through the driest, most exposed deserts. It is akin to a mountaineer going up Mount Everest. And so Strayed, armed with almost no hiking experience, boots that are too small, and a backpack whose weight she can barely stand under, is an unlikely candidate for this journey. But she is determined. Strayed soon discovers unexpected and even unnerving things about the trail. While she is stooped over a stream, using her water purifier to strain out the impurities as she pumps the gurgling water into the bottle, a man comes jaunting down the trail. "You must be Cheryl Strayed," he says. She thinks, "Indeed I am. And who are you? A hunter? A hiker? Charles Manson, maybe?" It turns out that he is a fellow hiker, and he had read her name in the trail register. He would be the first of many people, usually men, that she would meet on the trail. Now, almost always, these random people would be exceedingly kind. They give her food, directions, and help her lighten her backpack. They warn her about the weather and what to do if she confronts a bear. After her boots go flying over that mountain ridge, these strangers even help her fashion shoes out of flip-flops and duct tape until she can find a new pair of boots at a stop later on in the trail. The book shows the unmitigated kindness of people, especially when they are joined together in some common great task. And hiking the trail makes them feel an almost immediate siblinghood with each other. Now, Strade's backpack is something like a metaphor for her life. As she eats her food and discards what she doesn't need, loses her boots and other items, it begins to become lighter. Eventually, the tyranny of the next step of the trail begins to ease, and she starts to get clarity about the path of her life that winds both backwards and forwards. Strade's father had abandoned her family when she was only 5 or 6. For years, she'd wondered why he couldn't have stayed. She writes this: "It amazed me every time, again and again and again. Of all the wild things, his failure to love me the way that he should have had always been the wildest thing of all. But on this one night on the trail, as I gazed out over the darkening land after 50-some nights on the Pacific Crest Trail, it occurred to me that I didn't have to be amazed by him anymore. There were so many other amazing things in this world. In that moment," writes Strade, "I felt fierce and humble and gathered up inside, like I was safe in this world too, a feeling I had never before had." Strade begins to transform as she goes from being a clueless and insecure hiker to being a confident and experienced one. Her internal terrain begins to shift. The most powerful moment in the novel for me is when she confronts what she did to her marriage and to the people that she loved most in her life after the death of her mother. She had been unable to forgive herself for her infidelities and for her drug use, those two things that ultimately demolish her marriage and most of her other relationships. And so in one passage, while sitting on a beach, sun glistening on the water, she writes her husband's name in the sand, and then she says this: "I'd done it so many times before. I'd done it for years. Every time I visited a beach after I fell in love with Paul when I was 19, whether we were together or not. But as I wrote his name now, I knew that I was doing it for the last time. I didn't want to hurt him anymore or torment myself with all of the ways that I had wronged him. I wondered, what if I forgave myself? What if I forgave myself even if I'd done something that I shouldn't have? What if I was a liar and there was no excuse for what I'd done other than because I wanted to and needed to do it? What if I was sorry, but if I could go back in time, I wouldn't do anything differently than what I had done? What if heroin taught me something? What if yes was the right answer instead of no? What if what made me do all of those things everyone thought I shouldn't have done was also what got me here in this moment, in this place? What if I was never to be redeemed? What if I already was?" Now, I'm not sure I can boil this book or any book, especially a memoir, down to one message. But if I had to choose a major theme for it, I would say that it's the theme of acceptance. And acceptance is a powerful, wild thing. Strade is able to come to a place where she doesn't valorize her past wrongs, but she is able to accept them and the lessons and the life that she has gotten from them. She finds release from past regrets and says yes to life, both with all of its hardships and all of its beauty that is left to offer her. The poet Mary Oliver asks in her poem, What is it that you would do with your one wild and precious life? Strayd's answer is to accept all of the wild lessons that it has given, even with all of the jagged and painful edges that come along with it. Now, Stray doesn't learn this all at once, but rather again and again with each passing mile, with each new day that dawns over the Pacific Crest Trail. My spiritual companions, we celebrate water communion and the new life of a child today. We celebrate the new year and our being together in this place. It's a new day for us, too. Let us wake to it. Amen. I love you. May it be so.